Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14. With the regular season and conference championships now in the books, we have to decide who will make it into the college football playoff, along with all of the other big-time awards around college football. In today's video, I'll be going over the resumes of the top teams and players, and then down in the description, you'll be able to vote for who you believe deserves to get into the college football playoff, along with all the major awards. So these are what happened in the conference championship games in the last episode. There were some thrilling matchups. The buzzer beater touchdown by Middle Tennessee State to tie it. The Baylor-Cincinnati game going into 4 overtimes. And the other games were all very exciting too, but those were just some of the highlights. So as it stands now, we know 6 of the 12 teams going into the playoff. The Power 5 conference champions and the highest-ranked Group 5 champion will automatically go to the playoffs. Those teams are Florida, Virginia Tech, USC, Baylor, Cal, and Middle Tennessee State. They are all going into the college football playoff, and we have to determine their seedings. And along with that, we'll have to decide the 6 other at-large bids of playoff teams as well. This is what the poll looks like as of now. We're not really going to focus on the rankings when we go over these resumes, but more so the standings, point differential, signature wins, bad losses, and other important statistics for all of these teams. We're going to do a real deep dive into everybody to give all of the contending teams a fair shot of potentially making it into the college football playoff. Along with that, we'll be going over the resumes of the top players for the Heisman Trophy. We'll be going over their main stats, along with other storylines that could be reasoning for why they should end up winning the award. So we're going to start off here going through the 6 teams who are automatically in the college football playoff. We found these out in the last episode. The winners of the Power 5 Conference Championship games, along with the highest-ranked Group 5 Conference Champion. Last year, what I did was I had the conference champions all as the top 6 seeds. We had to order those and then order the at-large teams who have not clinched a spot yet from seeds 7 to 12. This year, I'm going to do it slightly different. The top 4 seeds will be occupied by conference champions, but the other teams can go in any order. So say, for example, a team like Baylor perhaps could be as low as the 12th seed. They are automatically in the college football playoff no matter what, but they are not guaranteed a first-round bye. I think this makes the seedings more fair, and it gives the higher-ranked seedings more of an advantage. We'll open things up with the SEC champion Florida Gators, who are currently ranked as the number 1 team in the country. But again, you guys are going to decide whether or not they are the number 1 seed or if they are a little bit lower. Florida's only loss came all the way back in week 3 on the road by just 4 points against a great Oklahoma team who is strongly being considered for the playoff. They beat Alabama twice. They clobbered Georgia. They clobbered Florida State, and they really looked the part in the SEC championship, beating Alabama fairly convincingly, 30-17. The Gators are led by senior quarterback Ernie Capellar, who we'll be talking about as a Heisman Trophy candidate and eventually as a possible first-round draft pick in this year's draft. Capellar was a little bit disappointing last year in the college football playoff, but he has significantly improved from last year to this one. They've got great playmakers on offense with Tondrick Suggs, Richie Rhodes, Chris Gentry, Brandon Pickens, and Derrico Callaway. All guys who can make big plays for this offense. They've got a great offensive line and statistically one of the best defenses in the country. They have a higher strength of schedule than just about anybody and a very high point differential as well. They have earned a very high seed in this year's tournament. What about Virginia Tech of the ACC? They went 11-2. Compared to other teams in the ACC, they had a very strong strength of schedule as well. They lost to Washington on the road back in Week 6. Washington's a pretty good team. And then, of course, in Week 13, they had the thrilling triple overtime loss against Duke. After that, they should not have been able to make the conference championship, but with Duke losing in Week 14, Virginia Tech slid in, and they took advantage, dominating Navy 29-0. They are led by quarterback DeAndre Jones, a dynamic junior who can make plays with his arm and with his legs. Virginia Tech is more of an offense-first team. They can score points in bunches. Their defense is a little bit inconsistent, however, but we saw how good they were against Navy, albeit Navy's option offense is pretty easy to game plan around, but Virginia Tech's defense was still fantastic in that game. And with a record of 11-2, winning arguably the second-best conference in the country, there's a lot to be said there. What about the USC Trojans, who were not expected to win the Big Ten championship? As we look at their resume, they started the season off a little bit shaky, losing to Indiana. We thought Indiana was going to be good this year. They were not. They beat Michigan State, who proved to be a pretty tough team. They beat Oregon on the road, one of just 2 losses this year for the Ducks, another team who's got a great shot of getting into the playoff. They did suffer a late loss back in Week 11 in overtime against a tough Stanford team on the road, but their signature win came in Week 14, a close battle against Notre Dame to clinch the Big Ten West, and then, of course, they beat Ohio State in the conference championship game. They only won by 8, but if you saw that game, USC dominated really up until the fourth quarter. They were clearly the better team. Scotty Kimbrell II was launching darts all over the field on that Ohio State defense. And these guys got weapons on offense with Monty Bradley out of the backfield, true freshman tight end, Squeezy Pryor Escobar, Cash Wade Jr., true freshman Tate Devine, who took over the conference championship game, and Caden Morgan. Defensively, they're a young group led by Johnny Machado and Lance Strulovich Jr., another true freshman. This is a team who has earned this opportunity after beating the Buckeyes. What about the Baylor Bears, who went 11-2 this year? They do have some shaky losses. They got clobbered by Vanderbilt in Week 6, and they lost to UConn in Week 8. Their combined record is only 66-79, that of their opponents, because the Big 12 was a pretty weak conference this year. Their signature win, I guess, would be the Cincinnati game, one of just 2 wins for them against over 500 opponents. Against Cincinnati, they trailed 21-3 late in the first half, but came back and were able to win in quadruple overtime. This is not a pass-first team. They are all about the ground game. Dontavius Brown is the engine of this football team with nearly 2,100 yards and 21 touchdowns, nearly identical stats that he put up last year. And again, we'll talk about Brown as a Heisman candidate later in the episode. Defensively, this is one of the best teams in the country. Their pass rush is phenomenal, with freshmen Isaiah Johnson and Josiah Fosky leading the way, and they've got a good secondary as well. Let's look at the Cal Golden Bears, the champions of the Pac-12. This team is one of my favorite storylines in the entire country. Last year, they were the darlings of the college football playoff, and this year they were given real expectations, opening up the season as the conference favorites and the 13th ranked team in the country. Then they lose to FCS Northwest, and it's not even like the game was that close. They lost by 13 points, they dropped out of the rankings, and since then they have gone undefeated, beating teams like Washington, Stanford, and overall, the Pac-12, I think, is a better conference than given credit for. I would argue the Pac-12 has been better than the Big 12 has this year. And then, of course, in the conference championship, they killed Washington 41-13. At halftime, the score of this game was 35-6. They could have won by more had they kept the pedal to the metal. Another big storyline with Cal this year has been the whole quarterback situation. They entered the season with junior Rufus Motley as their starter. Motley's an inconsistent passer, but is dynamic on the ground, and he's the guy they've built their offense around. Motley got injured pretty early into the season. He is now fully healthy and good to go. However, with how good Marquise Harris has been, it's hard to think Cal is going to make a switch at quarterback. Harris is not a runner, but he has done so well at the position. Why would Cal switch, and why not stick with the hot hand? Receivers like Matamuto Damba, Eberle Keltstan, and running back Harrison Myers lead a great group of skill position players. Defensively, they're very strong as well. As we saw in the conference championship against Washington, they did not allow a touchdown until the final 20 seconds of the ball game. The highest-ranked Group 5 conference champion this year was the Middle Tennessee State Blue Raiders. They'll have the honor of being the only team to make the college football playoff 3 years in a row. Last year, them and Michigan both got in for consecutive seasons, but Michigan's obviously not going to be back this year, being that they only went 500. The American Athletic is basically a lesser Power 5 conference. There are some really good teams in there, and Middle Tennessee State steamrolled their way through most of their opponents early in the season with good wins against teams like South Florida and Memphis. They then got blown out by Southern Miss, which really showed some of their vulnerabilities, and they barely beat UAB in the conference championship. If not for a miraculous last-second touchdown, they would have lost that game. They're led by senior quarterback Drain Ignatius, who's very steady and reliable. They've got a good group of playmakers as well, with guys like Taquan Pugh, Luther Lexeris, and others. The storyline I'm excited about here is Barrington Britt, their star running back who's missed most of the year. He is fully healthy. He played very well in the conference championship game. Their defense is very good too. They were pretty disappointing against UAB, allowing 31 points, and UAB's offense is not the greatest, but it's still a very, very strong unit. So those are the 6 teams who are guaranteed to get college football playoff spots. 4 of them will get first-round byes and the top 4 seeds. And then the other 2 teams will be seeded anywhere from 5 to 12, but they're all guaranteed to be in. We'll now shift our focus to the teams vying for at-large bids. These teams have not clinched a spot in the playoff yet, and you guys are going to have to decide not only which 6 of these teams do get in, but also the order that they will be seeded once we get into the playoff. We'll go in order by conference, and we'll start with the SEC because I do believe that was the best conference in the country. It's top-heavy. It's deep. Pretty much everybody in the SEC is at least decent. The 4 teams in this conference eligible for an at-large playoff spot are Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Texas. We'll start with the Crimson Tide, who went 11-2, winning the SEC West, but losing in the conference championship game. Their only losses this year were in Week 1 against Florida and in the SEC Championship against Florida. After their early loss against the Gators, they rebounded, beating teams like Notre Dame and Texas. They do have a lot of close wins here against not-so-good teams. That's sort of the ick on their resume, only beating A&M by 10 and Louisiana Tech by 5. Their win over Oklahoma was a big one, propelling them into the conference championship game, which obviously they ultimately lost. The quarterback position has been mainly played with Troy Davenport, who's been okay this year. He's gotten better in comparison to last year, but this is a run-first team. Darius Coley and Tyon Christopher are the engines of this offense. They do have some good weapons like Khalil Hassan and Coleslaw Appleby. Their defense is pretty solid as well. Jewel Chantel is a great young defensive lineman, and Ayo Oguga is a very talented corner in the secondary. Let's look at the Georgia Bulldogs now. These guys went 10-2, finishing in second place in the SEC East. After winning the College Football National Championship in Season 1 of this series, they were unable to get back to the playoff last year. They lost against Tennessee, and they got slobbered by Florida, but they do have some good wins in here, such as Oklahoma on the road, and most of their wins are in blowout fashion, although they do have a much weaker strength of schedule compared to most of their SEC counterparts. Aram Kachakan is the quarterback, the senior lefty, who has had a fantastic season, being looked at as a Heisman candidate. He led the team in rushing, a little bit ahead of true freshmen Miko Alexander and Marquise Edwards. Monty Grant, Sawyer Roberts, and Jair Williamson lead a pretty talented receiving group, and their defense has some elite talent. Guys like Dieter Jacobs and Tykeem Rogers are true blue-chip talents, but haven't been the most consistent this year. Their secondary is young but talented, led by possible future first-round pick, Amani Ward. The next team we're going to look at is the Oklahoma Sooners, who went 9-3. If you want to disregard record, Oklahoma completely belongs in the playoff. They have a point differential of plus 170. They have a high strength of schedule. They're the only team to have beaten the Florida Gators all season. However, the record of 9-3 does stick out like a sore thumb a little bit. They lost to Georgia, who's a very good team. They lost to Tennessee, although keep in mind Romeo Coloci was injured for that game, so I'll give them a pass. And then they lost to Alabama in arguably their most important game of the year. Most of their not-so-good teams that they play against, they blow them out. All of their wins are in dominant fashion. Romeo Coloci, the senior quarterback, is a possible top 10 pick in this year's draft. They've got a good run game. They've got plenty of good weapons, such as Noah Hampton, Eric Denman, and Desmond Rock. Their defense is led by Adrian Moore, who's been arguably the best defensive player in the entire country this year, and they've got a very young and talented secondary as well. This team is completely deserving, but if you factor in the 9-3 record, I can understand how it'd be a little bit harder to vote them in. We're also going to look at the Texas Longhorns, who have had an interesting season. Like Georgia, their strength of schedule compared to most other SEC teams is pretty weak. They lost all their games early in the year to Alabama, Mississippi State, and Oklahoma. 3 pretty good teams and 3 pretty close games. All of Texas's wins are by a lot, but the problem is they don't have a true signature win. Maybe Kentucky, the Wildcats were ranked at that time, but that's an overtime win against an under 500 team. I'm not sure if you can consider that a true signature win. Regardless, the Longhorns have won 7 in a row, largely because of the development of Onyx St. James. He hasn't been perfect this year, but he has shown some improvements as a sophomore. Arnold Giffen leads the backfield. They've got a balanced group of talented receivers with 4 guys with at least 6 touchdowns, and their defense has some NFL talent as well. Babatunde Mamadou is the projected #1 overall pick in this year's draft. The rest of the front 7 is great too, led by Moose Blankenvoort, Chinozo Obiasi, Donato Vaz, and they've got a good secondary led by Santo Irving. I think Texas is a pretty solid team, but their lack of signature wins is not ideal. Let's move to the ACC now. Who will be joining Virginia Tech here? The teams eligible are Navy, Florida State, Clemson, and Duke. We'll start with the Navy midshipmen. They won 11 regular season games, but there are some real question marks about this team. Their triple option offense is not built to win a college football playoff national championship. You have to take into account that this team won 11 games in one of the best conferences in the country. They beat a great Clemson team. They beat ranked Notre Dame. However, you also have to take into account what this team is going to be able to do in the college football playoff, and I'm not so sure Navy can make a run for the title. They barely beat Army in what was a very fluky game, and then in the ACC championship, they laid an egg. Their offense played horrible. This is not a team who can throw the football really at all. Chuck Burton in the ACC championship played terribly, and I think those conference championship games are a big indicator of how teams are going to do in the playoff. Their best player, Torian Wilson, suffered a multi-week injury in the ACC championship. I'm not sure if he's going to be healthy for the early portion of the playoff. While they do have multiple other 1,000-yard rushers, Torian Wilson is the engine of this football team. Now, defensively, Navy's really good. I thought they were solid in the ACC championship against Virginia. I think more of the issues in that game were their offense. But even so, I just don't trust Navy. But they did win 11 games. Next up, we'll look at the Clemson Tigers, who lost the national championship last season. They have one of the highest point differentials in the conference at plus 170, but they do have a fairly weaker strength of schedule as well. They lost to Navy, who is obviously a pretty good team. They have a lot of close wins early in the year against not-so-good teams. They needed overtime to beat Louisville. They did not beat Colorado State convincingly, and they lost to Florida State in Week 13. I guess their signature win would be South Carolina. The Gamecocks are a good team, and Clemson won that one pretty big. Clemson is an interesting team. They have Cedric Chapman at quarterback, but what teams are really worried about with Chapman is his ability on the ground. He's a dynamic rusher of the football. Aquesto Chigalamoklo is a great back as well. Malachi Evans is a very good receiver. And look out for Kion Cordell, one of their seniors. He's fully healthy now after missing most of the season with an injury. Defensively, they're very strong, one of the better units in the conference. And I think if they get back into the playoff, Clemson can learn from some of their mistakes from a year ago, in which they lost the national championship game to the TCU Horned Frogs. Next up is Duke, and they, for me, might be the most polarizing team in the country. They've scored nearly 600 points in 12 games. That's damn near 50 points per game. Do I need to say that again? 50 points per game. But defensively, this team is an absolute train wreck. They allowed 56 points against Miami. That's back when Miami was really good before their quarterback got injured. They beat Cincinnati. That's a good team. They dropped 70 against Boston College. That's a lot of points. They scored 55 against Rutgers, 49 against Virginia. And obviously their signature win was the triple overtime thriller against Virginia Tech. All they had to do was win their next game in Week 14, and they would have advanced to the conference championship. They scored 53 points in Week 14, and they still lost. They allowed 58 against UNC. Had they won that game against the Tar Heels, they would have made it to the ACC championship, and I think they would have clobbered Navy. So we could have been talking about Duke as a possible #1 overall seed in the college football playoff had they not allowed 58 in Week 14. Senior quarterback Justin Tucker is a special player. This is a guy who's going to be a top 5 pick in this year's NFL draft. He is box office must-watch television and would be a joy to watch in the playoffs if Duke were to get in. Their #1 wide receiver, Jabari Kruger, statistically was the best receiver in the country this year, winning the receiving triple crown. They've got so many good weapons on offense, but the problem is their defense is horrible. This team is pretty similar to Houston last year. HEISMAN contending quarterback, but a terrible, terrible defense. And ultimately, that's really the concern about this Duke team. They allow 40-plus points consistently. Florida State is the last team we'll talk about in the ACC. The Seminoles went 9-3 this year. They had a much higher strength of schedule than most of the other teams in the conference. If you look at their resume, they lost to Virginia Tech only by 1. Not a bad loss. They beat Navy by 3 possessions. That says something. They beat Miami in overtime on the road. That's a very good win. But they do have some close wins against bad teams. They only beat LSU by 10. They only beat Maryland by 6. They lost to Syracuse in Week 11. Although they did beat Clemson in Week 13, which is a big win, they got blown out by Florida the following week at home. The Seminoles, the past 3 seasons, have been so close to making the college football playoff, but they find ways to lose games at the end of the year, and that ended up being the case this year. Jacob King's been a solid quarterback. They've got some good weapons here with guys like Jay-Sean Tate, who ran for over 1,000 yards, and a pretty good receiving corps led by Garrett Rodriguez, Stanley Bentley, and the dynamic playmaker Romani Pierre-Cross. Defensively, this team is pretty good. I would say their defense is inconsistent, but certainly talented, particularly the front unit. Let's now shift our attention over to the Big Ten. We've got 3 teams eligible for an at-large bid in the playoff: Ohio State, Oregon, and Notre Dame. We'll start with the Buckeyes, who lost in the conference championship game to USC. They were supposed to beat USC and be talked about as the potential number 1 seed in the playoff. They had the highest point differential, nearly plus 300, of any team in the entire country. Pretty much all of their wins are blowouts. They kill everybody on their schedule, and it's not like they had an easy schedule. They lost to Virginia at home in overtime. Virginia's a tough team, but pretty much all their other wins against good teams are blowouts. They demolished Illinois. That's when the Illini were on their big winning streak. However, they disappointed in the conference championship. They nearly made a miraculous comeback, but they were still down by 24 points at the start of the fourth quarter. Puma Whitlock, the sophomore quarterback, is very, very good. He is probably the best pure quarterback prospect in the country, despite only being a sophomore. Mookie Davis out of the backfield, in my opinion, is the best running back in the entire country as well. Ohio State was my preseason pick for the national championship, and if they do get into the college football playoff here, I would be hard-pressed not to view them as one of the overall favorites. I really see this team as one of the best in the country, and their plus 300 point differential really shows that. So if you have to play Ohio State in the playoff, if they get in, it's going to be a tough out for you because these guys are real good. Let's move over to the Oregon Ducks, a team who won 10 games last year. They made the playoff as an at-large bid, and the Ducks are in a similar situation this year, although I think their resume is a little bit worse than it was a year ago. They lost to USC, who's a very good team. They lost to UCLA. Remember, Barrett Cherokee, their quarterback, missed the first half of the UCLA game. Their strength of schedule is not great, though, 63-82. They've got a lot of blowout wins. I guess their signature win would be Notre Dame late in the year on the road. The Irish are a pretty good team. Oregon's offense does not score as many points as some of these other teams being considered, but that doesn't mean they don't have guys who can score. Barrett Cherokee, the senior quarterback, threw for 40 touchdowns and just 4 interceptions. They've got a good group of playmakers here. Cherokee's obviously great on the ground. Mason Tartle's very close to 1,000 yards. Patrick Cherokee has 666 rushing yards. He might be the devil. And they've got some great receivers. Junior Justice Everdeed really broke out on the scene. Maverick Cherokee, Chris Cox, and Zarif Maruzuari are very good as well. Their offensive line is phenomenal, and defensively, they're pretty solid as well. It's a young group. They don't have a great pass rush, but their back end and secondary is quite solid. I also wanted to throw Notre Dame. I wanted to put their hat into the ring of possible at-large teams as well. They did only go 8-4, which is not ideal. Last year, they won 10 games, made the playoff, and laid a stinker. They played horrible in the first round. They lost early in the season to Alabama. They did beat Stanford, which is their big signature win, but losses late in the year to teams like Navy, Oregon, and USC have me questioning how this team can perform against great teams. They did have a very good strength of schedule, and their point differential is surprisingly high. This is another team who really focuses on the ground game. Baz Boyd showed some flashes as a passer, but this team is all about running the ball, all about their senior back, MJ Hill, who finished with almost 1,900 yards, 19 touchdowns, and a ridiculous 7.3 yards per attempt. Defensively, the Irish are pretty solid as well. They've got a very good front seven. They've always had a good front seven throughout this series. This year, no different. Their secondary is very solid as well, but the fact that they're 8-4 and had trouble winning big games does concern me a little bit. I wanted to give a mention to Washington as well. The Huskies went 10-3 in the Pac-12. I felt them being a double-digit win Power 5 team meant that they should at least be talked about here. They lost to Stanford and Cal pretty early into the season, but they really rebounded, winning their final 9 regular season games, including beating Virginia Tech, a college football playoff team. That's a big win. In the conference championship, they had a real opportunity to prove themselves, and they played horrible. There's no other way to put it. They sucked against Cal. Their offense was flat. Their defense was a train wreck. And that was Washington's opportunity to really prove themselves, and they didn't. Losing 3 games in a weaker Power 5 conference does not bode well with all these other 9 and 10 win teams in conferences like the SEC and the ACC. They do have a pretty talented offense, and their defense is very strong. And going into the Pac-12 championship game, some of their team statistics were a lot better than Cal's. They had a higher point differential prior to that game. They get more sacks than just about anybody, with Zach Chase and Tony Aditi, who have combined for 18. I wanted to give South Alabama some love as well. They won 10 games in the American Athletic Conference. They tied UAB for the best record in the West. UAB had the tiebreaker, hence why they made the conference championship. South Alabama does not have a good strength of schedule. They don't have a good defense, but boy, do they score a lot of points. Their only losses this year are against Rice, in which they scored 45, and UAB, in which they scored 28. Keep in mind, UAB has the highest scoring defense in all of college football. This team scores 40 and 50-plus points per game on the regular. Quarterback Kujay Reddings led the nation in passing yards while throwing for 52 touchdowns. That's a lot. Reddings led the team in rushing, and sophomore transfer wide receiver Sammy Wusus had 18 touchdowns and statistically was one of the best receivers in the country, with 2 other guys having over 900 yards and 4 players of at least 9 receiving touchdowns. Defensively, this team is not great, and if you compare them to the South Alabama team that we had back in year 1, this defense is a whole lot worse. I don't think they'll be able to match up with some of the best offenses in the country, but they're a run-and-gun team who scores a lot of points. I also wanted to give some love to Bowling Green. The Falcons went 12-1, winning the MAC. That's a tough-ish conference. It's not a Power 5 conference per se, but I think it's better than most of the Group 5 conferences. They lost to Old Dominion in Week 3. They lack a signature win, though. Maybe Iowa State? I mean, the Cyclones aren't that bad. They didn't play and beat a team who finished over 500 until Week 13. Their only wins against over 500 teams are Buffalo and Akron, who they beat by a combined score of 8. They handled Toledo in the conference championship. The game was pretty close in the first half, but Bowling Green ran away with that game in the second half. The problem I have with this team is I don't think they can match up with any of the top teams in the country. Yes, they went 12-1, but they played nobodies for the most part this year. They don't have many impressive wins, and their strength of schedule is really poor. You thought their strength of schedule was bad. Idaho's is like way worse. Their combined opponents' records are 44 and 88. That's terrible. I still wanted to give Idaho an opportunity. They won 11 games. They were the de facto Mountain West champions, but they only played against 2 teams all season who finished with a record of over 500, one of whom they lost to. They played against 2 Power 5 schools, Rutgers and BYU, who won a combined 3-21. After Week 8, in which they beat Nevada, they did not play against another team who had more than 3 wins. Yikes. Despite that, you can only play the teams on your schedule, and Idaho was very good this season, again winning 11 games. Their point differential was better than Bowling Green's, but their strength of schedule is also a little bit worse, being that they play in a rough conference. They do have a very good passing attack, and I think they'd be a fun team to watch in the playoff, but similar to Bowling Green, I don't think they'd really have much of the shot because all the other teams are just better, more dynamic, more athletic. Enough said. Let's talk about the Heisman Trophy now. The game decided to give the award to Puma Whitlock, the quarterback of Ohio State. Again, with this vote, it doesn't really matter who the game gives it to, but I do feel that Puma Whitlock absolutely deserves a mention and will be on the ballot. This is Whitlock's first year as a starter. He put up very good numbers, 3,100 passing yards, 38 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions in 13 games, completing 66.6% of his passes. He might be the devil. He added 14 rushing touchdowns on the ground to go along with over 900 rushing yards. The team went 11-2, losing in the conference championship game, but Puma Whitlock did score over 50 touchdowns. Justin Tucker of Duke had a phenomenal season this year. A 4-year starter with the Blue Devils, Tucker finished in 3rd place last year in our Heisman vote, and this year he was statistically way better. Almost 4,000 passing yards, 45 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 73% completion percentage, valuable on the ground. He scored more than 50 touchdowns, only turned the ball over 4 times, and won 10 games with a trash can of the defense. Aaron Katchikan from Georgia was the favorite to win the award for most of the year. 3,300 passing yards, 40 touchdowns, 70% completion percentage, almost 50 all-purpose touchdowns while only turning the ball over 5 times, leading Georgia to a 10-2 record. Ernie Capellar is the best player on arguably the best team in the country. 3,400 passing yards, 38 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 70% completion percentage, and he's very valuable on the ground as well. Keep in mind, Florida went 12-1, They won the SEC championship. They were the best team in the best conference in the country, and that's because of this man right here, Ernie Capellar. Dontavius Brown was the Baylor offense last year. His numbers from last year to this year are strikingly similar. 2,075 rushing yards on nearly 7 yards a carry to go with 21 rushing touchdowns, 6 yards of 20-plus yards, 500 yards after contact, and a receiving touchdown. He is the engine of the Baylor offense. There were some players who did not finish in the game's Heisman voting that I did want to put in our ballot, including Q.J. Reddings of South Alabama. 4,400 passing yards, 52 touchdowns, 366 passing yards a game, 65% completion percentage. He only averaged around 4 yards per carry on the ground and did turn the ball over 11 times while not playing against the best of competition, but it's not like South Alabama has a loaded roster anyway. Romeo Coloci of Oklahoma started the season as the top projected quarterback in this year's draft. Justin Tucker may have passed him, but Coloci was great as well, with around 4,000 all-purpose yards, over 40 total touchdowns, only 5 interceptions, completing 69%, nice, of his passes. The last player we'll mention is Barrett Cherokee, the quarterback out of Oregon. He completed 68% of his passes, around 2,800 yards, 40 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. The Ducks went 10-2 this year. They finished second in the Big Ten West and had a very, very good season as they look to get back into the college football playoff for a second straight season and hope for a better ending than last year. Not to mention, Cherokee also averaged around 60 yards per game on the ground with 6 rushing touchdowns as well. So that's going to wrap up the episode here. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to cast your vote in the description. Every vote matters. Make sure to vote for the teams going into the college football playoff, the seedings, and all of the big-time awards. Please take your vote seriously, as it does largely impact what's going to happen in the future of this series, and I'm excited to see what the vote ends up saying and who you guys believe deserves to be in the college football playoff, along with all the major award winners. That'll wrap up the episode. I hope everyone enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.